A young king holds a victory feast in the early months of 330 BC. Wine, music, and torchlight fill a vast stone terrace. This is Persepolis. For 2 centuries, it has been the ceremonial showplace of the Persian Empire, a sanctuary where kings of kings took tribute and swore sacred oaths. Tonight, a conqueror from Macedon sits in their throne. He is barely 25 years old. By dawn, the great cedar beams of the palace will roar with fire. The heat will crack the towering stone columns. In a single night, the sacred heart of the Achaemenid dynasty will turn to ash. How does a state that once ruled from the Indus Valley to the edges of Greece fall so fast? How did the largest empire on earth unravel in just 4 years? To understand the collapse, we must understand the machine that was broken. The story begins with Cyrus the Great. In the middle of the 6th century BCE, he forged a new empire by absorbing the Medes, and a decade later, he achieved the unthinkable. He captured Babylon. But Cyrus did not sack the ancient metropolis. He walked through its gates as a restorer, carefully respecting local gods and keeping the established order intact. He built a system where a new dynasty could rule from old, wealthy cities without destroying the very things that made them rich. It was a masterpiece of political engineering, a state built on integration rather than mere annihilation. Then came Darius I, who took power in 522 BCE. Darius turned rapid conquest into a permanent administrative machine. He divided the massive realm into satrapies, which were provincial districts governed by royal appointees. He standardized taxes and issued the gold daric, a coin weighing just over 8 grams. This meant that for the first time, pay, tribute, and trade could move smoothly across vast distances under a single standard of value. Darius was not just a king. He was an architect of bureaucracy, transforming a collection of conquered lands into a cohesive superpower that felt permanent. At its absolute height, the Achaemenid Empire stretched over 5 million square kilometers. It reached from the Indus River in the east all the way to the Aegean Sea in the west, and from the Oxus River down into Egypt and Libya. No one in human history had ever stitched so much of the earth under a single crown. It held perhaps 40% of the world's population at the time. To look at a map of the ancient world during this era is to see a single, continuous political entity that dwarfed everything around it. It was, for all practical purposes, an entire continent with one undisputed master. To hold such immense geography together, the empire relied on the royal road. This great highway linked Susa in the east to Sardis in the west, spanning over 2,600 kilometers of mountains, plains, and deserts. The Persian court established a highly guarded relay system. Couriers would gallop between way stations, swapping exhausted horses for fresh ones. Under ideal conditions, a royal message could fly across the empire in just 7 to 9 days. A normal traveler on foot, or with a simple caravan, would need 3 agonizing months to make the same journey. Speed was the ultimate weapon of the Persian king. Behind the galloping couriers was a mountain of paperwork. Imperial Aramaic served as the unifying administrative language, acting as a bridge across dozens of local tongues. In the ruins of Persepolis, archaeologists have found thousands of clay tablets recording the daily rations of grain, wine, and sheep given to workers, travelers, and royal officials. You can literally feel the logistics of empire in these dry administrative lines. The state systematically fed the people who built the palaces, paved the roads, and collected the taxes. It was a massive, quiet hum of logistics that kept the ancient world turning. The genius of the Persian system was its flexibility. Satraps ruled their provinces alongside local elites, leaving local laws, religions, and customs entirely alone. Cities kept their gods and their traditional courts. The king in Susa demanded only three things: taxes, troops, and unquestioning loyalty. In return, the conquered peoples received secure roads, reliable coinage, and generations of peace. This grand bargain was why so many different nations could live under one crown without rising up in constant rebellion. The empire was fiercely efficient, yet deliberately hands-off. Nowhere was this unity more visible than Persepolis. Begun by Darius around 518 BCE, the complex was expanded by Xerxes and Artaxerxes over the next century. Persepolis was not a capital in the modern sense. The administration ran from Susa or Babylon. Instead, Persepolis was a seasonal stage, a sacred mountain terrace designed for New Year rituals, grand audiences, and the delivery of tribute. It was the architectural embodiment of Persian power, built not for daily paperwork, but for overwhelming psychological awe. Step onto the Great Terrace, and you would face the Apadana, the royal audience hall. 72 massive columns were planned for this structure, each rising roughly 20 meters into the sky, topped with enormous stone capitals carved into the shapes of twin bulls or lions. The engineering rivaled the absolute largest temples the Greeks could ever dream of building. These columns held up a sprawling roof of thick Lebanese cedar, creating a cool, dark, cavernous forest of stone where the great king sat in state. To reach the king, visitors climbed the monumental eastern staircase, whose walls remain a masterpiece of ancient propaganda. The stone reliefs depict delegations from every corner of the empire. Ethiopians, Egyptians, Lydians, and Bactrians step forward in endless, orderly lines. They carry bowls of precious metal, fine textiles, and purebred horses. There are no scenes of slaughter or subjugation here. The message carved into the rock is one of harmonious order, many different peoples retaining their unique dress and dignity, all moving in the same direction to serve one undisputed master. But even the most perfect machines eventually develop hairline cracks. Between 372 and 362 BCE, the empire faced the great satraps' revolt. Governors in the western provinces, men like Datames and Ariobarzanes, realized they commanded enough wealth and Greek mercenary troops to challenge the center. The Persian court eventually won the war and crushed the uprisings, but the struggle exposed a dangerous truth. The vast distances that protected the empire also allowed its wealthiest governors to act like independent kings. Trust began to bleed out of the system. At the same time, foreign wars drained the treasury. Egypt broke free from Persian rule and remained independent for decades, until Artaxerxes III ruthlessly dragged it back into the empire in 343 BCE. The brutal reconquest drained attention, money, and manpower. Meanwhile, inside the royal palaces, a powerful eunuch courtier named Bagoas began making and unmaking kings through assassination. When poison becomes the primary tool of royal succession, an empire loses its moral authority. The state was eating itself from the inside out. This was the fragile inheritance of Darius III, who ascended the throne in 336 BCE amid the bloody fallout of royal murders. Darius inherited a realm that was massive but deeply uneasy. He faced restive borders, a hollowed-out court, and a desperate need to prove his legitimacy to his own generals. And just as he took the crown, a storm gathered on his western horizon. A young Macedonian king crossed into Asia, fast, focused, and hungry to claim the greatest prize on earth. At first, The Persian high command had a brilliant strategy to stop Alexander. They leaned on Memnon of Rhodes, a brilliant Greek mercenary commander on the Persian payroll. Memnon's plan was simple and devastating. Avoid pitching battles on land, use the vastly superior Persian navy to strike directly at Greece, burn the coastal cities, and starve Alexander of his supply lines. It was a strategy that would have forced the Macedonians to retreat. But in a stroke of catastrophic luck for Persia, Memnon suddenly fell ill and died. The one man who truly understood how to exploit Alexander's weaknesses was gone. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont. He threw his spear into the Aegean sand, claiming the continent by right of conquest. He stopped at Troy to honor the ancient heroes, casting himself as the living heir to old Greek glory. It was a brilliantly loud message. He was not leading a frontier raid. He had come to dismantle a superpower and replace the great king on his throne. The first real test came in May at the Granicus River. The water was fast and freezing, and the Persian cavalry waited on the muddy far bank, expecting Alexander to halt and search for a safer crossing. He did not. Alexander personally led a wedge of his companion cavalry straight into the churning water. In the chaotic melee that followed, a Persian noble raised his axe to split Alexander's skull. A Macedonian officer named Clytus the Black severed the Persian's arm mid-swing, saving the king. The shock of the Macedonian charge broke the Persian line, leaving all of Asia Minor completely defenseless. By November 333 BCE, Darius himself marched out with a massive imperial army to crush the invaders at Issus. But Darius made a fatal geographic error. He pinned his massive force in a narrow coastal plain between the mountains and the sea, completely neutralizing his numerical advantage. Alexander saw the bottleneck and immediately launched a surgical cavalry strike directly toward the royal chariot. As the Macedonian wedge violently pierced the Persian center, Darius panicked and fled the field. Seeing their king run, the Persian command structure instantly vaporized in a cloud of dust and terror. In the abandoned Persian camp, Alexander found the unthinkable. Darius had left behind his own mother, his wife, and his daughters. In a brilliant piece of psychological warfare, Alexander treated the royal women with intense, publicized respect. He ensured they kept their titles and dignity. This display of clemency sent a shockwave across the empire. It signaled to Persian governors that Alexander was not a barbarian raider who only wanted to loot and burn. He was acting like a legitimate sovereign, ready to replace Darius gracefully. Alexander was winning the propaganda war just as decisively as the physical one. The final showdown approached, and the ancient world looked to the skies for answers. On September 20th, 331 BCE, a lunar eclipse painted the moon blood red. Both armies watched the dark sky in terror. Babylonian astronomer priests scrambled to interpret the omen. Through complex ritual logic, they declared that the dying moon represented the king of Persia, not the invader. The psychological damage was severe. Before a single spear was thrown on the plains of Mesopotamia, the morale of the Persian forces began to rot from within. 10 days later came the Battle of Gaugamela. Darius had meticulously chosen a wide, flat plain and even leveled the ground so his devastating scythed chariots could charge without obstruction. He planned to send these bladed wagons straight into the Macedonian infantry, tearing their tight formations to bloody ribbons. But Alexander had studied the layout. He drilled his men with a specific countermeasure. They would hold their nerve until the last absolute second, then step aside to open wide lanes in their ranks. The chariots would pass harmlessly into empty space. On October 1st, the chariots charged, and the Macedonian trap worked perfectly. The horses ran into the open lanes, and the Greek infantry quickly closed behind them, dragging the drivers to the ground. Then Alexander launched his masterstroke. He rode out toward the right flank, dragging the Persian left wing with him and stretching their line until a seam ripped open in the center. Instantly, Alexander wheeled his cavalry around, formed a tight wedge, and drove straight through the gap toward Darius. For a second time, the great king looked death in the eye, turned his chariot, and fled. The empire broke for good. The collapse of the center was breathtakingly fast. By late October, the ancient gates of Babylon swung open without a fight. Alexander entered the great metropolis, offering wealthy gifts to the local temples and claiming the loyalty of the priests. Soon after, the administrative capital of Susa surrendered its keys. When the royal treasuries were opened, the wealth inside defied comprehension. Greek historians claimed they found tens of thousands of talents of gold and silver bullion. Overnight, the staggering accumulated wealth of the Achaemenid dynasty was melted down, stamped into Greek coins, and used to pay the very men who had destroyed the empire. But the heartland did not fall without a fight. In the harsh winter of 330 BCE, a loyal satrap named Ariobarzanes ambushed the Macedonian army at the Persian gates, a narrow mountain pass near modern Yasuj. Persian archers rained death from the cliffs, halting the invaders in the snow. It was a Persian Thermopylae. But local shepherds guided a Macedonian detachment up a treacherous goat path in the dead of night. At dawn, Ariobarzanes found enemies both in front of and behind him. The defenders were slaughtered, and the road to Persepolis lay utterly undefended. By early 330 BC, Alexander walked onto the grand terrace of Persepolis. The ceremonial heart of the world belonged to a 25-year-old. Months later, during a lavish victory feast, the palaces were set ablaze. Some ancient historians blame a drunken impulse, sparked by an Athenian courtesan named Thais seeking revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century earlier. Others believe it was a cold, calculated political signal, a fiery broadcast to the entire world that the old sacral order was permanently dead. Whatever the motive, the dry cedar caught fast. The terrace of nations became a blackened graveyard. Meanwhile, the last Achaemenid king was fleeing eastward, desperately hoping to raise a new army in the provinces of Bactria. But his own lords had lost all faith. Near Hecatompylos, the satrap Bessus seized Darius, stabbing him and leaving him to die in a dusty wagon as the Macedonians closed in. When Alexander finally found his rival, Darius was already breathing his last. Alexander reportedly covered the corpse with his own royal cloak and ordered a full state burial in the royal tombs. He then marched east, not as an invader, but claiming to be the lawful avenger of the murdered Persian king. The staggering truth about the fall of the Achaemenid Empire is that it was a decapitation, not a demolition. The central monarchy fell in just 4 years, but the vast imperial machine simply kept running. Alexander kept the satrapal system in place. He kept the local elites in power. He even adopted Persian royal dress and court rituals, much to the fury of his Greek generals. For the average farmer in Egypt or merchant in Babylon, taxes were still collected, canals still irrigated the fields, and couriers still rode the royal road. The only thing that changed was the name stamped on the decrees. Walk among the ruins of Persepolis today, and you can still see the sheer scale of what Cyrus and Darius built. The massive stone column bases stand like silent sentinels. The broken faces of stone bulls lie half buried in the dust. You can still see the black scorch marks of Alexander's fire scarring the great staircases. It is a monument to an empire that felt completely invincible right up until the absolute moment it vanished. The terrace still tells the story of one long, devastating night. Yet the Persian legacy survived in brilliant ways. High on a cliff face at Behistun, Darius I had his victories carved around 520 BCE in three distinct scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Over 2,000 years later, in the 19th century, European scholars used this trilingual cliff face as a monumental Rosetta Stone, finally unlocking the forgotten secrets of cuneiform script. A royal boast meant to project eternal power ended up becoming a master key to recovering the lost voices of the ancient Near East. Follow water in the dry country, and you will find qanats, underground tunnels engineered by the Persians, still feeding green fields today. Roads and habits of rule deeply outlived the kings who commanded them. The Achaemenids built a resilient, brilliant system designed to outlast generations. It was undone by a few crucial battlefield mistakes, court fractures, and an enemy who simply moved faster than their massive bureaucracy could react. That is how empires truly end, slowly, in the small things, and suddenly at the top. If this journey through the ashes of the ancient world lit a spark, stay with Dustkings. We bring clear, vivid stories of ancient rises and falls back to life. Subscribe and drop a like if you enjoyed walking this path. There are always more ruins to explore and forgotten roads to walk on the channel. Until next time, travel well.